Today we're going to be looking at how did warfare change in both the 20th and 21st centuries. And really the key point here is that warfare has changed more in the last 115, 116, 117 years than in some ways it has since 1250. So this is a key part of our course. So how has warfare changed in the 20th and 21st century? Now, technology, science, industry have all substantially changed warfare this century and last century, along with the constant development of the media. This includes things like tanks, aircraft, computer-guided missiles, drones, and even nuclear weapons, but also the fact we now have a 24-hour news media with almost instantaneous news updates. 2 world wars were fought, and we had the crucial invention of nuclear weapons, which completely changed warfare. The size of the army, civilian casualties, and the scope of the conflicts grew massively until the end of World War II. However, since then things have declined slightly, as no 2 major powers have fought a direct war since, largely because of the fear of mutually assured destruction. Still, the 20th century was the bloodiest in history, with the most deaths and the most casualties, and a war being fought almost constantly throughout the century. A key change in this time was to do with the makeup of the armies. Now, actually, in peacetime, the army stayed a relatively similar size to what it had been previously, between at its max in the century around 250,000 all the way down to around 80,000. However, the composition of the army has seen quite significant change. Now, in 1914, infantry made up 65% of the army, to nowadays where actually it's only 25% of the modern army is made up by infantry, because the army is so complex and involves so many different types of troops. Cavalry made up 10% of the army in 1914, and now cavalry does not exist. However, the modern equivalent of tanks still make up roughly 10% of the army. And you can see a Challenger 2 tank, the main British tank in the armed forces today. Artillery made up 20% of the army in 1914, but it was only 10% in 2015, as bombing the enemy was also carried out by aircraft and tanks, and the weapons used for artillery were very different, as they were now mobile and on the backs of vehicles. The biggest change, however, is in specialist units, as these have gone from about 5% in 1914 to 55% in 2015. And these could be medical, administrative staff, or a whole range of different troops, which we'll look at now. So a key question is, what do we mean by specialist troops? But before we look at that, it's worth looking at the structure of the army in general. So in 1908, Lord Haldane, the Secretary of State for War, partly because of the performance during the Boer War, decided to reform the army and set up 2 branches to it, which pretty much exist still today. So he divided the army into the regular army of around 150,000 troops and the territorial army of 270,000 men. Nowadays, we still have a regular army and an army reserve, which has replaced the territorial army. Effectively, what you have is the regular army are permanent troops, the standing army, as it were, whereas the territorial force or the army reserve are part-time soldiers or reservists who are trained and often quite specialised, but don't fight in the army as a full-time job. Now, within both the regular and territorial army, the biggest change has been in the growth of specialist troops. These include groups like the Royal Engineers for building bridges and carrying out work on the battlefields, the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers for looking after vehicles and equipment, Logistic Corps for organising logistics and the running of the army, and the Royal Army Medical Corps who carry out the medical work. Now, Logistics Corps was about 15% of the army, Army Medical Corps was about 3%, Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers roughly 10%, and the Royal Engineers 10%. So none of these are as big as the infantry, but you can see that taken together, they form a large part of the army. And there are also troops like the ones pictured here, like the Explosive Ordnance Disposal units for disarming bombs and in particular IEDs. So a whole range of different specialist troops now make up the army. As we've seen previously, a lot of warfare is about whether the war is a war of movement or a war of defence, according to the weapons. Now, up to 1918, there were new developments in technology which helped improve attack and make war about movement. For example, in 1914, the Germans used railways to move their troops to carry out a surprise attack on France through Belgium. So the war of movement was encouraged by the use of railways. However, machine guns, quick-firing rifles and trench warfare turned it back into a stalemate. The German advance was halted by machine guns and artillery before it reached Paris, and so by 1915-16 it had become a stalemate and a war of defence. To counter this, both armies developed the use of tanks first of all, then planes to bomb the enemy, and motorised transport to move troops rapidly. And towards the end of World War I, you started to see a war of movement again. Now this war of movement continued to develop up to 1945 during World War II. So by World War II, the weapons of attack were even stronger. Tanks were far more effective and could move at 20 to 40 miles per hour, attack the enemy very quickly. Aircraft could bomb and machine gun troops, and aircraft like the German Stuka bombers were very effective. And aircraft could also parachute troops behind enemy lines, and they could all use radios to coordinate their attack. And this led to new tactics such as the German tactic of blitzkrieg or lightning war, which is to attack quickly and punch through the enemy lines and cause as much damage as possible. And this tactic helped Hitler take over much of Europe in 1939 and 40. However, from 1940 to 43, air defences improved, minimising the impact of aircraft. Now, this is partly because of fighter planes such as the Spitfire or the Hurricane being far more effective at fighting the bombers. The development of radar from 1943 onwards to be able to spot the enemy aircraft, and the improvement in anti-aircraft guns, partly from using radar to shoot down planes. And so you start to see a bit more of a stalemate again. But again, a new technological advance in the use of bombing improved, caused the emphasis to switch back to attack. This is due to a range of technological and strategic factors. This is because bombers had more air support, the bombers improved, the technology improved so they could aim their bombs better, they had more fighter cover, and the strategy changed so that they were bombing at night time and doing carpet bombing to hit whole large areas rather than targeted bombing, which was never as effective. Lastly, of course, the atom bomb changed bombing completely by being able to wipe out whole cities. We also see the development of two new terms in the 20th century: total warfare and war of attrition. And what happened was that the 20th century saw, at this point, the end of limited warfare, the idea that you just fought limited battles to try and outmaneuver and destroy parts of the enemy, to something called total warfare, which was when the countries had to use all their powers to try and defeat their opponents, largely because the countries had very similar resources. This would include increasing the political powers of the state to focus on war, so that the government taking control of industry, for example, to make sure it's all focused on production for the war, whole population being involved in the war effort in different ways, all scientific, technological, industrial resources being focused on the war, spending vast sums of money on inventions like radar and the atom bomb, and also lastly attacking the resources and civilians of the enemy. And we mentioned this with the area bombing that started to happen in World War II to try and wear down the enemy, which also links into this idea of war of attrition, where both sides' main aim is to try and wear down the resources, money and manpower of the other side to defeat them. Now, you see this in the fact that actually in both the First World War there were 10 million casualties, Second World War 15 million casualties, and about 45 million civilians. So the wars were about trying to wear down the enemy by killing as many of their people as possible. Another development was the invention of chemical weapons. Now, In early warfare, there had been attempts to poison wells or poison food supplies for the enemy, but chemical warfare came about as part of the idea of total warfare, about trying to use all your resources, including chemicals, to try and damage their troops and wear them down. In World War I, German troops used chemicals, particularly mustard gas, against the French, killing many. In fact, in one attack, 1,250 troops were killed. However, military benefits were quite small. Wind limited chemical weapons impact, and soon most troops had gas masks. However, it struck fear into people, and a range of chemical weapons have been developed since, many not having to go through the gas mask, some actually blistering the skin and causing damage on any kind of contact. However, in 1925, 16 major nations signed the Geneva Protocol, promising to never use chemical weapons again due to the horrifying effects they could have, and this was followed up in 1997 by the Chemical Weapons Convention, being signed by 190 nations banning the storage or use of chemical weapons. However, they're still used. Iraq used chemical agents against Iranian and Kurdish civilians in the 1980s, and the Second Iraq War was partly fought over the fact that people thought Saddam Hussein still had chemical weapons. More significant has been the impact of nuclear weapons. Now, first of all, nuclear weapons effectively ended the war between the Allies and Japan in 1945. The Hiroshima bomb, which was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, killed 70,000 people instantly and destroyed 70% of buildings were damaged or destroyed in the city of Hiroshima. The USSR promptly followed the American invention by exploding an atomic bomb in 1949, and by 2015 there were 9 nuclear powers. Britain alone has 200 nuclear warheads and can cause untold damage. However, arguably, nuclear weapons have prevented war due to the principle of mutually assured destruction. What this means is that there's a stalemate between the nuclear powers, because they know that if they go to war with another nuclear power, they could wipe out each other's country and effectively the whole world using their nuclear weapons. So some people argue that nuclear weapons have actually caused less war because we no longer have wars between major powers. But there have been further advances in technology which have changed military equipment as the world has become a high-tech place. Infantry now carry body armour which can withstand bullets and helmets, night vision glasses, personal radios, telescopic sight and laser aiming assault rifles fixed with grenade launchers, showing that they've become very high-tech with their equipment. Infantry are now transported in helicopters, with Apache attack helicopters being armed with missiles providing aerial support. Often warfare can be fought from the other side of the world using intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, which provide aerial support and can be fired from land, ships, submarines or even vehicles to support the troops. Stealth bombers have been developed that are difficult to spot on radar and can sneak through and bomb enemy targets. And modern jets can carry laser-guided bombs that are accurate to 10 meters. Drones can also be used to deliver bombs, meaning that troops and pilots no longer need to be anywhere near the battle. And lastly, fixed artillery places have been replaced by mobile vehicles. Perhaps most importantly, satellites are used for surveillance of enemy troops and targets, showing that warfare has become very high-tech. Now, these developments have significantly changed strategy and tactics. Most modern warfare follows a very similar pattern. What happens is that ICBMs and aircraft are used to bombard enemy positions, then helicopters and motorised vehicles are used to deliver infantry to the battlefield, right where they're needed. Tanks, jets, attack helicopters, mobile artillery are then used to support the infantry in trying to destroy the enemy positions. And during World War II, the Allies developed the Revolution in Military Affairs, which involved commanders at headquarters controlling the fighting using high-tech equipment, which is now the norm, using satellites, radios and all the equipment available to the modern army. Lastly, this has led to 2 very important tactical developments. First of all, we have asymmetric warfare, is when war is unequal, as one side has better weaponry than the other. With the cost of the armed forces going up and up and up, we now have this being a very common thing in warfare. A Typhoon fighter jet costs £80 million, whereas a British Challenger 2 tank costs £4 million, so clearly only wealthy nations can afford to have the most high-tech weaponry. So the cost of warfare, and also the fact that the nuclear powers won't fight each other, has made asymmetric warfare very common. And then linked to this is the idea that the weaker country in asymmetric war has to rely on guerrilla warfare tactics to compete. They can't engage in open battle, they don't wear uniforms and fight a more powerful enemy using hit and run tactics. So in summary, technology and science have changed warfare and made the last 100 years the bloodiest in history. The composition of the army has changed, with 55% of the British Army now being specialist troops and cavalry being replaced by tanks. As new technological advances happen, warfare has become more about attacking until the opposition develops a counter to this attack and returns war to a stalemate. Total warfare and war of attrition have become key approaches in this time frame. Chemical weapons have been used by some powers but are limited by international agreements, but nuclear weapons are now more common with 9 nuclear powers, but in some ways make war less likely due to the principle of mutually assured destruction, and in fact they have not been used since 1945. Other new technological advances have made modern armies incredibly high-tech, and they use strategies that match this. This means war are often asymmetrical, and the enemy has to resort to guerrilla tactics to engage in warfare.